One of the recurring topics Jeremy and I have talked about and discussed is various people who are involved with what you'd call what is known as the alt-right here in America and here in the West. And while we haven't really done a general breakdown or analysis of the movement, we did a show just about a week ago talking about what we believe are the historical roots of the current, what we know now as the alt-right, the new right, which go back to the McCarthy era and the John Birch Society. But we've never really broken down we've talked about a few of the prominent personalities within the alt-right. Of course, Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson, and we've discussed, of course, on one of our shows we talked for a few minutes about David Duke. The alt-right, though, I think understanding, it's just like understanding the progressive media under Obama, or even now, and understanding how foundation and billionaire funding, as well as having assets of what you call the deep state working within progressive media and activist organizations, shapes and influences the narrative that many of these top outlets and organizations take on issues related to foreign policy, related to the two-party system, and vice versa. For example, Amy Goodman and her funding, the sources of her funding, probably reveal a lot about why she has taken such a pro-intervention, pro-Western-based human rights organizations with a vested interest in pushing the official Western government media narrative on the Syrian conflict, that the Syrian government is to blame, along with the Russians, and that the rebels, people who are fighting the government, are noble and just, and that we must have humanitarian intervention, which, as we've seen in the past, ends up leading to military intervention, because the humanitarian and military intervention are carried out by the same people. But the funding sources for these progressive media and activism media outlets, activist organizations, I think reveal a lot about why they take the stance on why so many of these outlets take a pro-intervention, pro-official, towing the line of the official Western narrative on the Syrian conflict, as well as Libya under Obama. Of course, the Libyan conflict and the Syrian conflict, and on other issues as well, including the water carrying in most cases, I believe, that Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Did for Hillary Clinton. So much like an understanding of how foundation funding and having assets from within the entrenched deep state apparatus affects the programming, affects the quality, affects the material coming out from these ostensibly alternative progressive media outlets. It's equally important to understand who and what is influencing and affecting the alt-right's perspective on these same important events, such as, I would say, the presidency of Donald Trump and the conservative movement in America today. So we've talked about a few of these people, and I'm going to go a little more into this because Jeremy and I, in our I believe it was our most recent program, one of our two most recent shows, we talked about how it seems at this point that the goal of the alt-right movement, that includes both the Ziophiles, as we call them, because we don't like the term, I don't like the term philo-Semitic, because philo-Semitic to me, Jews are not the only Semites. Muslims are Semites, Arabs are Semites, but I like the term I like the term philo-Zionist because I think that's much more accurate than philo-Semite. Philo-Semitic, I think philo-Zionist is much more accurate. Whether it's the philo-Zionist or whether it's the people who take a more anti-Jewish tone in their reporting and in their commentary. The common goal that this entire movement has at this point, I believe, regardless of what Donald Trump does, regardless of Marine Le Pen, regardless of whatever other quote populist leaders rise up in the West, the goal at this point, where I think they're all in lockstep on, is to continue to promote and to portray this movement that created Donald Trump, that has brought all of these Western European politicians, populist party, to positions of prominence and influence, that this movement, that the belief that this was an inherently good movement, that this movement can create real everlasting change, it can truly actually shake up the political system and the established order, as long as people on the alt-right continue to speak out and to continue to gain influence, and eventually, even if people like Donald Trump sell us out, eventually, if we're vigilant enough and our voices are strong enough and we keep the faith and we stay the course, eventually we'll have a politician that will come in that will listen to us and that will actually fulfill our agenda. That's the key, I think, of this movement. And it transcends Trump, it supersedes Trump. But also another important aspect of this, I believe, is that anything that Trump does that betrays his campaign rhetoric, that does not match up with what he stated he would do on the campaign trail, and things that he comes in as president that he flip-flops on or reverses course on, that it's not because Trump all along was like a made man of this a very powerful Zionist global mafia and economic elites. It's not that, it has nothing to do with his lifelong love and allegiance to the state of Israel. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's all because he's being subverted and manipulated and by people like his son-in-law Jared Kushner and of course Ivanka, and both sides of this of this alt-right, whether it's the Zionist-friendly philo-Zionist, as you can see, is evidenced with outlets like InfoWars and Breitbart and WorldNet Daily, Drudge Report, many others. Even you got now people like Laura Ingraham and Ann Coulter and Michael Savage making inroads into the alt-right. And even some people will ridiculously say that Sean Hannity is out of the mainstream and he's now part of their movement because he supports Trump, or Tucker Carlson because he's critical of progressives on his program and on his Fox News program. But their narrative is that Trump is being taken over, is being usurped, is being infiltrated and subverted by globalists led by Jared and Ivanka. That Jared and Ivanka are straying him in the wrong direction because they're influencing him to do things to contradict and break his campaign promises. You see now, it's very funny that InfoWars went from a big shift in. You go back to December during the transition period. President-elect Trump, and Alex Jones and Roger Stone were pushing the idea that Gary Cohn and Steven Mnuchin, people shouldn't be concerned about Trump bringing them into his cabinet. Mnuchin is Treasury Secretary, and Cohn is the top economic advisor. You shouldn't be concerned about that because they're the good, patriotic Goldman Sachs bankers. You know, not everybody at Goldman Sachs is a monster, and they're the good patriots. Never mind the fact that Gary Cohn was the vice president to Lloyd Blankfein, who is once stated that he, as the head of Goldman Sachs, was doing God's work. You never mind that. These were the good, patriotic Goldman bankers. We had nothing to worry about. And, of course, you know, Stephen Bannon, the nationalist, patriot, ex-Goldman banker who led Breitbart and is now should be the voice of nationalist reason. If only Trump would stop listening to Kushner, you'd have Steve Bannon come in and actually fulfill his campaign promises and make America great again. Steve Bannon was completely silent about Mnuchin and Cohn and Kushner and all them. And yet you fast forward to April and it's becoming obvious that Trump is starting to backtrack on some of his campaign promises. Once it became obvious that Trump was starting to backtrack and move away from his campaign promises, including his rhetoric on NATO, on I believe what the Export-Import Bank, backtracking on his campaign promise to heighten economic tension with China, referring to China as a currency manipulator. Something I'm not for increased economic conflict with China, but I can see where supporters of Trump see that as a betrayal of his campaign promises. But once Trump really becomes obvious that he's really beginning to move back on these campaign promises, now the rhetoric has shifted. Now the tone has shifted. It goes from, well, see, these are the good patriotic Goldman bankers that we don't have to worry about, to they were brought in by Kushner to infiltrate and subvert the campaign away from its nationalist America First course and onto a typical neoliberal globalist course. And it's exactly how the narrative played out. And then you had all this talk of a conflict between Kushner and Steve Bannon over the path and the course of the country. And I don't doubt that they may have some legitimate they may butt heads in some areas as far as certain matters, but I don't know. I get the impression that a lot of this is exaggerated, and it fits the narrative for an exaggerated Bannon-Kushner squabble conflict, because it keeps alive the idea that Steve Bannon, as the head of Breitbart, is leading the patriotic, America First wing of the Trump administration, and that this is what Trump really believes. Whereas the idea that the globalists are subverting the Trump administration keeps alive this narrative, this belief that, see, Trump was a good man, he's well-meaning, but he's being misled. And that Kushner's bringing in Cohn and Mnuchin and McMaster, and that the only reason things are going wrong in the Trump administration is because Jared Kushner's bringing in bad people to put the campaign in a more globalist, neoliberal direction. And so that's how they're from the portion of the base of the alt-right that is more critical of Jewish power and Jewish influence. You get the narrative that Jared and Ivanka are staging a Jewish takeover of the Trump presidency. I've heard it referenced by David Duke and some of his guests as a Jew d'état, in that Mnuchin and Cohn are in there to push the Jewish agenda as opposed to the globalist agenda, the Zionist agenda. But it's the same narrative that Trump is being manipulated, he means well, and they're pushing him away from his true campaign promises, and therefore he's not really to entirely blame for all it goes wrong in his campaign. He's just listening to the wrong people. We've got to influence him to listen to the right people. And that's the narrative that you continue to get. And we've gone over, I think Jeremy and I talked a little bit about some of the reasons why we find David Duke to be a person who, with him, perhaps not everything, there's more to David Duke than meets the eye. We went into a couple of interesting events from during his life that we find interesting, and I'm not going to get too much into that again here, but That includes his his claim that he flew flights for Air America during the Vietnam War when his father was working with the State Department, I believe, as a contractor in Southeast Asia, and Duke got a job in Laos as a young adult, teaching English to Laotians, and with on behalf, actually, it was with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Duke claimed during a campaign for either governor or senate in Louisiana in the early 90s that he flew flights for Air America. So that's one interesting claim. There's Air America was pretty much just a haven, was used to smuggle drugs in and out of Southeast Asia. Very profitable drug industry in Southeast Asia, of course, which is never talked about in the official history of the Vietnam War or of U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And that's what Duke claims. And then from there, Duke also took part in Operation Red Dog, which was a ultimately failed and aborted plan by far right wing figures that had connections. There were connections within this to the Reagan administration, as well as to other aspects of of what we call the deep state, to overthrow stage a coup in the Caribbean nation of Dominica, which was actually supposed to be, I believe, the launching ground for the for Grenada operation, which ended up being delayed for 2.5 years against the Marxist socialist government in Grenada, which of course took place in '83. But Duke was a key financial figure in getting money together, and also in getting people within the Ku Klux Klan and the white nationalist movement of the time involved in this operation. Don Black, the founder of Stormfront.org, which has been for a long time the most influential white nationalist message board on the internet. Perhaps it has been overtaken now by sites like the Daily Stormer, which has its own issues that I think that people at the Renegade Radio Network have done a very good job of discussing and analyzing what Andrew Anglin and the Daily Stormer truly represents. But Don Black was involved in this with David Duke, the Operation Red Dog. So these two events here, combined with his constant media presence that he's had for the past 4 decades, constantly being portrayed as the face of the white nationalist movement, and now as like the elder statesman of the alt-right. Of course, Duke has taken like a mentorship kind of mentor-apprentice type of relationship with younger leaders like Richard Spencer, who comes from the National Policy Institute, founded by William Regnery III, the member of the CIA-connected Regnery family, Regnery Publishing, the conservative book publishing empire, which put William Buckley on the map. William Buckley's agent or superior when he was working for the CIA in Mexico in the late 40s and early 50s, E. Howard Hunt, says that wrote, I believe in his memoirs, that Regnery received CIA funding early on when it was first got off the ground. And William Casey served on the CIA director under Reagan, one of the founders of the modern day national security state, was on the board for Regnery in its early days. And Regnery, another member of this Regnery family, one of the sons of Henry Regnery, who was the founder of Regnery Books, William Regnery II, founded the National Policy Institute and maintains a close relationship with Richard Spencer to this day. Duke has had this mentor-apprentice relationship with Spencer as well as Andrew Anglin. And while all of this, I understand if I'm talking about this, I'm saying, well, it means these guys are bad, and this means these guys are assets or agents of some sort. I realize that it doesn't, and that's not my case here. I'm not trying to say that because of these things that so-and-so is an agent, or David Duke is an agent of the federal government or of the deep state, or that Andrew Anglin or the Richard Spencer are. I'm not saying that. I think, though, that you look at these very interesting connections, very interesting aspects to their stories, combined with the media coverage that these people receive. I mean, Richard Spencer has been covered so many different areas, so many different he's been covered by so many different media outlets and given all of this free publicity constantly. I mean, I would dare argue that him getting punched during the inaugural protests did more to build his name recognition and name value than anything else that has happened. I mean, the Washington Post headline, "Party Like It's 1933, Richard Spencer." Richard Spencer was just on CNN. He's been profiled by The Atlantic, by Al Jazeera, by many other places. And these people will cite it's the fact that, well, we're having the most influence. And perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. But Spencer being given all this promotion, Andrew Anglin is increasingly frequently referenced from articles from sites like the Forward, or Jewish Telegraphic Agency, or many other mainstream sites which detail the alt-right movement. He's regularly mentioned in these articles, and David Duke, of course, has been the media fixture for the past 4.5 decades. I like to call him, David Duke, the Chomsky of the alt-right, and whereas they're both elder statesmen for their movement, but they both, I believe, and I'm going to get into this in a minute with David Duke, omit very important details from their commentary and leave their followers, I think, in the dark about some very important topics, whereas Chomsky uses his platform to distract and move people away from really dissecting Zionist influence, Jewish power, Zionist power, Zionist control and influence. David Duke just emphasizes constantly Jews, 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 and doesn't give any more real insight other than just the Jews. And I think they serve the very same purpose Duke and Chomsky do, and it's to misdirect and mislead people and lead them astray. And they both serve as the elder statesmen for their groups, for their movement, so to speak, with Chomsky being like the mentor to the younger generation, like Glenn Greenwald, and Duke likewise doing the same thing with Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin. They are maturing, they're grooming the new generation of dissidents that are going to take their place. Duke has been, as I said, just like Chomsky, a media fixture for the past 4.5 decades. He's been like the go-to person who has been affiliated and associated with white nationalism and white separatism and anti-Zionism and criticism of Jews and Zionism and of all that, of Jewish power and all that. And I think Duke helped Trump. I talked about this in our previous show. I think that Duke coming out and endorsing Trump and then Trump refusing to disavow his support actually helped Donald Trump, as did David Duke running for Senate in Louisiana on the same platform that Donald Trump was running for president on just this past year. And I think that really helped Donald Trump in a lot of ways, because it solidified the anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish wing of the alt-right behind Donald Trump, and it also continued to push the narrative that Donald Trump is being persecuted, he's being oppressed, he's being mistreated and picked on by the establishment that is out to get him and out to destroy him and do everything in their power to bring him down. So that's how I see Duke as being he's been definitely the guy who has been he's been the alt-right figure over the years within the anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist wing of the alt-right that has received the most media coverage. It is probably his most famous personality. He's very much been a creation of the media. And Duke is and since Jeremy and I really began to see just how important of a figure David Duke is, because we longest time thought of him as just being like this fringe person who didn't have any real influence over anything. But turns out, I believe we were wrong about that. So I've started to follow sporadically, not regularly, but from time to time I'll listen to his program on the Rents Network, on Jeff Rentz's radio network, just to get an understanding and to hear him and to get his perspective and to hear where he's coming from on these things. So I noticed he was very pro-Trump and was very much a champion of the America First rhetoric that Trump was putting out. And then once Trump got elected, I think that's around the time when I started to really see to get that David Duke had much more influence than I ever gave him credit for having. He was really strongly pushing the idea that bringing in Steve Bannon and a few others was just the great Jeff Sessions, who I call John Ashcroft on steroids as the Attorney General, that these were great moves, and this was proof that Trump truly intended to drain the swamp, and hashtag MAGA. And Duke was very silent about Gary Cohn being brought in there as the chief economic advisor, as well as Stephen Mnuchin as the Treasury Secretary. And there was no talk from Duke really about Kushner. But then you fast forward to, I believe his rhetoric really shifted after the bombing of Syria, the Tomahawk missile strike on Syria after the chemical weapons attack the Syrian government was alleged to have carried out. I think that's when Duke's tone shifted, and he really took this President Kushner is usurping Trump, and he's manipulating and moving Trump in the wrong direction. And it's funny how after all this time of no critical analysis of Donald Trump's past, of the fact that he has been surrounded his entire life by these hardcore Zionist, globalist, financial and mafia elites, that it is no critical analysis of this. It's just that when he was running, it was the Jews that were opposed to him. All the neocons in lockstep hated him, and the Jewish establishment in lockstep hated him. There was no daylight between the entire Jewish community and their opinions on Donald Trump. And this is proof that he's one of us. He's our guy. He can do the great things for us that are going to bring us back to being America again. And he's going to save Western civilization. But however, once it becomes clear that Trump is beginning to really move away from his campaign promises, Duke pushes that it's because of the Zionist, Zio-communist usurpers Jared Kushner and his converted wife Ivanka, bringing in bad people like Gary Cohn and Stephen Mnuchin, and to a lesser extent, because he's not Jewish, he is a goy after all, H.R. McMaster, who's a puppet of the Bill Kristol wing of the neoconservatives, which, by the way, I don't find incorrect. I'm just relaying how they presented here, and that this is the reason for all of the problems within the Trump administration. That and the alt-right base, like the Daily Stormer and the rest of them, are all marching in lockstep with this narrative. See, Trump is selling us out, or Trump is moving back on his promises because he's being manipulated and moved in the wrong direction. But we could still have his ear, and we need to make this movement continue to grow. And even if Trump betrays us, we'll still get other people in there. It's the exact same thing that the philo-Zionist wing, with InfoWars and Breitbart are put. That yes, Trump is being manipulated, he's being misled in the wrong way, but we have to continue to. The good people have to continue speaking up and letting him know what they think, and he'll listen to us. So you're getting that. And Duke, though, his program, I've noticed in his program over the last month or so, when I've listened, I'll probably check out maybe one show, maybe 2 shows a week, where he has these people come on, like Anglin from the Daily Stormer, and they'll talk about. Duke has like the same 5 or 6 talking points that he repeats over and over and over again when talking about laying out his case for like Zionist power. And it's the Levant affair, it's USS Liberty, it's Jonathan Pollard, it's an article that David Brooks wrote in the New York Times talking about, Jewish domination of the media. It's the fact that Hillary Clinton's top campaign donors were all Jewish, of course, George Soros at the top of the list. And now it's this narrative, this meme that Kushner embraces and worships the Lubavitch aspect of the Shabbat Lubavitch movement, and he's done business with George Soros. And never mind that Donald Trump also has very close friends who are involved in the Lubavitch movement that go way back before he knew Jared Kushner, hardcore Orthodox Zionists. Steve Bannon, never mind that Steve Bannon has run a website that brags about being conceived in Israel, and has a Jerusalem outlet based out of Jerusalem. He started a Jerusalem wing for Breitbart, and he And Breitbart is much more hawkishly pro-Zionist than most other media outlets, even neoconservative outlets. Never mind all of that. I mean, it's that kind of analysis never makes it into his commentary because it doesn't fit the narrative that good guy Trump, who really is one of us at heart, is being misled by the Jew usurpers from within here. And yesterday on his show, he repeated the same things over and over again with his guest Eric Stryker, another person from the Daily Stormer, and they were lamenting how Jared and Ivanka are Marxists or Zionists and Marxists at the same time, and how they're doing business with George Soros and with Goldman Sachs. It's like, oh my God, Trump never had any Goldman Sachs influence. I mean, no, just the fact that his chief strategist was Goldman Sachs. But Bannon, that's a good Catholic Goy non-Jewish name, so never mind that, despite the fact that pretty much everybody else in positions of leadership at Breitbart were and are Jewish Zionists, hardcore Zionists. Never mind that. It's all Kushner, and Kushner's doing this, and this, and he's trying to keep Steve Bannon out, and he's trying to kick poor Sebastian Gorka out. I mean, you gotta realize, man, Kushner is the only problem here. It's Kushner bringing in Cohn and Mnuchin, who they were very silent about before the election. And now they're all up in arms about them. It's all Kushner. I mean, look, Gorka and Bannon, I mean, who cares if their goal is to start a new crusade in the Middle East against Islam, like not just a war on terror, but a war on Islam, as we're going to recreate the medieval 10th century, 11th century crusades to, take back our civilization and also bring about like the apocalypse with all this apocalyptic Christian Zionist nonsense about the end times. And never mind that they want to start a new crusade. No, they're good goys with good Catholic names, and they say a lot of things that we like about immigration and nationalism and all this. And so, their influence doesn't count. All the negative things about them don't count because they're white men. They're good goy, and they can and they would surely pursue our best interests if only they would listen to us, and if only the people like Jared Kushner were not in there. I see this narrative coming from Duke, and it's extremely dangerous because it's just the latest example of how this entire alt-right movement, from InfoWars all the way to Duke and Daily Stormer, are completely leaving their followers in the dark about who Donald Trump really is, who and what he really represents, and the reasons why this presidency is not turning out the way that his campaign rhetoric said it would. Although in some ways it is. I mean, he was never a non-interventionist. He's always made clear his propensity and his desire to want to bomb the hell out of ISIS and just kill as many people as he can with impunity if he needed to. But this complete ignorance of what Trump represents and what he means, it's right up there with how you just leave out an omission of the deep state analysis in general. There's no room for a critical commentary of what Breitbart media represents with David Duke and the Daily Stormer and Kevin McDonald and Richard Spencer and all these other alt-right thinkers. And you can go back into the other wing, of course, as well, with Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos and Breitbart and Mike Cernovich. Mike Saudi's run the CIA Cernovich. A critical analysis of Steve Bannon and Breitbart is not in the cards. It doesn't fit their agenda. A critical analysis of the people who Sebastian Gorka represents, like Frank Gaffney and his Center for Security Policy, and or Pamela Geller or David Horowitz. He's a Jew, by the way, that they refrain from criticizing. There's no room for that in analysis in their narrative. There's no room for an analysis of Donald Trump's lifelong connections to what we talked about before, the hardcore Zionists involved in the mob and financial elites in New York City, of course, including Ronald Lauder of the World Jewish Congress, and Lou Eisenberg, who was with the New York Port Authority, was directly involved in the transfer of properties to Larry Silverstein pre-September 11th. Trump's close relationship with these people, there's no room for that kind of analysis. I believe Mark Dankoff tried to bring it up a couple times on David Duke's show, and it was pretty much ignored, and it was Duke just pretty much completely ignored the topic when he tried to bring up some of Trump's connections. There's no room for any of this analysis here, and you have to ask, why is that? There's also no room for critical analysis of September 11th. If it's InfoWars, or if it's Alex Jones, who was at one point the leader of considered the leader of the 9/11 Truth Movement, and is still promoted within the mainstream media as being the face of the September 11th Truth Movement, it's all Saudi Arabia that was responsible for September 11th. And then the Duke wing, Duke and Stormer, those types won't even really address September 11th and the serious questions regarding what actually happened on September 11th. So my conclusion that I've come to, until I'm proven otherwise, and I welcome dialogue and debate on this topic, and I know I'm not the only one. Nick Spiro at Circus Maximus Radio would love to discuss these topics with some of the alt-right people out there. Once again, I just see that I interpret this as actually serving power in the name of fighting against it, because I believe the information that they leave out of their narrative is the most important information of all. They have traded in a deep analysis of what the Trump movement represents and what the nationalist wing of the Trump movement represents, which is led by Breitbart and Steve Bannon. What that actually represents in favor of a narrative that it's the Jews, or if you're Alex Jones, it's the globalists led by Jared Kushner, are usurping the presidency and are causing him to betray his promises. That's all been traded in, and we got to ask ourselves, why is this? And I've come to the conclusion that it's being done to actually shield Donald Trump as well as the system in general from the real criticism and the real questions and the real exposure that would cause serious damage to this false paradigm we're in. But now, instead of actually calling out the entire false paradigm for what it is, which that's at least one thing that you could credit some of these people with doing in the past, they're now just, and we could talk all day about the merits of white nationalism and white supremacism or whatever, but I look at it like this: I'm going to treat these people on an individual basis, and I'm going to judge them on their merits based as individuals, because they're human beings just like we are, and because they have an ideology that's nationalist or that prioritizes European, what they believe is interests of European peoples over everybody else, does not make one an evil person who's should be shunned from society. I mean, we've got to judge these people on an individual basis, just like we would judge anyone else who espouses any other ideology on an individual basis based on the merits of what they're talking about, because they have legitimate points as well. I mean, you can have beliefs that you can believe in European nationalism and still have legitimate viewpoints and still be a legitimate opponent of the established agenda for American and global for the future of our civilization. You can still have astute analysis on what's going on in the world, and I've come to that conclusion. And say in all personal politics aside, because I don't want to get into personal politics, because I think that's one of the areas where this really under Trump is personal politics is so, and personal worldviews have become so toxic and poison that we fight over this stuff, and we're losing our ability to connect and to correspond with people who we should probably be listening to, because they have politics or personal views that we believe are abhorrent and make them less than human, and that mean that they should not have any kind of role in polite society. And I think that's a bunch of bullshit. But getting away from personal ideology and all that, many of these alt-right people could be trusted to at least while probably most likely surely throwing some disinformation in there, they were at least standing up against the entire system as it was. Now they're embracing the system by embracing an elite created movement. Oh, and speaking of which, I left out the name Robert Mercer. There's no analysis of Robert Mercer from any of these people and what he represents. You know, David Duke could go on and on and on every single day about George Soros and Goldman Sachs. Not a peep about Robert Mercer and the role he played in getting Trump elected. It's just funny how that works out, but you know, we can have a conversation about this, but I believe that this is very likely looks like it's a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to shield Donald Trump and to actually shield the deep state that David Duke and Alex Jones, as being like the heads of their respective wings of the Trump movement, represent. That the same deep state that they claim to abhor so much, they actually aid and shield this deep state from the real criticism that could lead to a genuine people's movement to bring this system down. I believe they're actually protecting the system by shielding Donald Trump and giving a false impression of why things are playing out the way they are in the Trump administration. So any feedback is welcomed, and as always, as we always say, let's have a conversation about this stuff, and let's start changing the paradigm and really opening up true free dialogue on these matters. If you have nothing to hide, then you're not afraid of corresponding about this, whether it's Alex Jones or whether it's the editors at Breitbart.com or whether it's Richard Spencer or Andrew Anglin at the Daily Stormer or David Duke, whoever you are. If you have nothing to hide, then you have no reason to fear a genuine debate, dialogue, correspondence on these matters. But anyways, I'm just giving my 2 cents on what I'm seeing here with the alt-right movement, and in particular what we're seeing from a guy who I never really knew had as much influence as he has, David Duke. And what I'm seeing is the why and how they're misleading their bases into a false reality of what's going on under Donald Trump. So thank you.